Okay, hey everybody, welcome. This is our first presentation for Video 300. Yay! Tonight we're going to be talking about the seasonal cycle of the vineyard. So this will just be a very good introduction to viticulture, what happens in the vineyard throughout all the cycles of the year, right? So let's just go ahead and get started. So overview of what we'll be talking about tonight. I always like to start my presentation with an overview so that way you guys have an idea of the format of what we're going to talk about. It just helps me stay focused. Hopefully it helps you stay focused and whatever keeps us organized, right? So we're going to talk about the structure and function of vines. We're going to talk about spring, summer, fall, and winter in the vineyard. So spring, we mainly have bud break. Summer is flowering and fruit set. Fall, we see a lot of fruit ripening and harvest, and then in winter, we see dormancy. So we'll talk about structure and function first. So structure and function, the grapevine itself is a really interesting plant. They're kind of like monsters, honestly. So it's known as a woody and perennial plant that contains above ground systems, which is the trunk, shoots, flowers, leaves, fruit, and then an underground system, which are the root systems, right? So they're also classified as perennial because they are cold hardy. They return in the spring and they live for more than 2 years. But the interesting thing about them that kind of makes them like these monsters is that they're also known as structural parasites. They have these specialized parts called tendrils. All these little, they look cute and these little curly things. These kind of work as hands that reach out and grip onto things that are more sturdy and then help the vine grow upwards to compete for sunlight and nutrients and just to survive, right? So this is just survival of the fittest at its finest, you know, and so this is what makes grapevines so amazingly survivalist, right? They will survive many interesting and tough hard times. So we have that. Another thing I highlighted here was the lateral shoot. So this is a shoot that grows off of the main shoot. We're going to talk about anatomy next, and it actually wasn't in the little picture for this next 2 slides, so I wanted to show it to you guys in this one. So this is a lateral shoot coming off of, oh, here we go. There's the main shoot, and this is the lateral shoot. This is another shoot growing off of the main shoot. Okay, so now we have some anatomy. So grapevines, you typically find them in this what we call bilateral cordon training system, where we have the main like trunk of the vine, and then it goes out into 2 arms, also known as cordons. Cordon in Spanish means like cord, so you think of that as like 2 cords coming out of the main body, right? And this is called the bilateral training system, but there are others as well, but this will just hopefully help you understand the terminology, right? So we have the trunk, which consists of the scion and the rootstock, right? So trunk, both of these. The scion is the upper portion where we've grafted onto, and the rootstock is a different vine. So typically for vines in the United States and even across the world, right, they're grafted, which means that the rootstock is typically an American rootstock, so American native variety, and that's because we have this horrible pest called phylloxera that just ravages and eats through the roots and the soils of all over the world now. American rootstocks are very resistant to phylloxera, so that's why we have to graft. The upper portion is typically a European Vitis vinifera variety, which is much better for winemaking, produces really nice grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc, Tempranillo, and so on, right? So many different varieties, all under the Vitis vinifera species. So that's the reason that we do have that grafting, right? So a graft brought together the scion and the rootstock. These are 2 different vines growing together, kind of Frankensteined together. Hopefully that makes sense. Next we have the head. So the head is the portion at the very top of the vine here where the cordons come out of, right? So this is central part of the vine. The arms and cordons hold the canes and shoots. So these are going out in the bilateral method. So these are the cordons, also known as arms. Then we have canes and shoots. So a cane is so it's in the springtime when this grows, it's known as a shoot. When it's still green and alive. During the winter season, it will actually lose its leaves and lignify. It'll become more woody and hard. That's when it's called a cane. So same structure, different times of the year. shoot is in the spring, a cane is in the winter, but they'll both be available for you on the quiz, right? So this long part that's growing from the cordon is the cane or shoot. How it's currently displayed is the cane, so the leaves have fallen off, and this is the winter woody time. Then we have our renewal spurs. So after winter, when we prune, what's left behind is a renewal spur. It's called that because these buds will grow and be the new shoots and canes the following season. This is our renewal spur that's left behind. Then we have our buds, right? So we have buds on the renewal spur, but we also have buds on these canes over here too. These are left behind. It's a massive tissue that contains an entire shoot in the berry set for the new season. And then we also have the internode. So internode is the space basically between the nodes, right? So between buds, there's actually a structure of the cane, right, where it has like a diaphragm and it's like these little nodes in between each one. So that is the internode. And then the leaves will grow directly where the buds were. Okay, cool. So there's a little, I was always confused about this as a student, so I just wanted to put this in the presentation. We're not going to talk too much about this in the class, but down the road, if you take other courses or you start to talk to other viticulturists, they'll talk about like lateral buds versus latent buds. There's like different types of buds on the vine. So as the shoot grows during the season, it'll form buds at the axil of the leaf. So at the very bottom of the leaf at the base of the petiole, you'll form buds. So you can see this in this picture here, right? So this is a leaf that's growing, and then we have these buds growing at the axil of it, or at the bottom of the petiole. That's what this stem is called. So the single bud in the region is commonly referred to as the axillary bud or the lateral bud. It doesn't help that we have multiple terms for this. There's like a plant biologist term, and then there's like a viticulturist term, so you'll just hear people refer to both of them. So axillary or lateral bud. An additional bud is formed in the bract axil of the lateral bud called the dormant latent bud. It's called this because it normally does not open the same season it is created. So what we see in this picture is that lateral bud is turning into a lateral shoot. It has bursted open, and now another shoot will be growing in the upward position from this main shoot. And then the dormant or latent bud will be left behind for the following season. So if they prune this back here, this will be a new shoot the following year, but it's just an extra dormant bud. So hopefully if that helps you, wonderful, but I found that confusing a lot as a student, because I'd be like, what's the difference between latent and lateral? So now you know. Okay, so let's just go ahead and hop into springtime in Vineyard to talk a little bit about structure and function of vines. So springtime in vineyards is kind of what we're ending right now for us. We're kind of heading into the summer season. It's getting hot. We're very developed. Springtime is when we see a lot of like the new growth coming in. We also see a lot of the beautiful cover crop. That's what's planted between the vines. As you can see here, we have some like mustard seed and some other like wildflowers growing. You'll see it's a very beautiful time for the vineyards. So let's talk about it. So in springtime, we typically see the significant event is bud break, which is also referred to as bud burst, just depending where you're from. So these are the buds. These are the latent buds, right? The dormant buds that were left behind during the wintering season. And now that it's springtime and the weather's warming up and the sun shines out, the grapevine recognizes that, and then it actually will open those buds to start that new growth. So these are old buds left over from last year. They overwintered, which is why it makes it a perennial plant, right? They've bursted open, and now these will be the shoots that contain the fruit and everything for the new harvest. So that's bud break. This is a wonderful time that marks the new season for viticulturists and for winemakers alike. However, this can be a really delicate time in vineyards because all this fresh new growth is just lovely chow for deer or other animals, right, that munch on vegetation. So you need to be very careful that you have deer fencing in your yard. Of course, deer are out and about during the springtime, of course. So if they come through and just snack on all this small new growth, you will not likely have any harvest that year. So that would be very, very sad. And they really like it when it's all soft and young green like this too. Another problem could be frost damage. So if you have, weeks and weeks of really nice weather and your buds start to break open, but then all of a sudden we have a frost come through, then these leafy new green buds that have just opened up could frost over and die, and then you could lose your entire crop that way too. Same goes for like severe storms, like severe rain, storm conditions that can break these. These are very delicate at this stage. That could be very, very sad for your vineyard. So it does happen. Hopefully it won't happen to you if you own a vineyard, but that is something to look out for. Then also I'll add like powdery mildew and stuff too, but that we get more into that as you progress into the program and the classes. Okay, so after bud break, we just see a lot of shoot growth in general. So about the first week or two after bud break is pretty slow growth. The vines are just getting their holding onto the season, but after that, there's a huge period of rapid growth called the grand period of growth, and this can be up to 1 inch of growth a day, which is crazy. And this will continue on until just after fruit set. Then all the energy will be shifting to focus on developing the fruit. So literally within the period of a month, maybe like a month and maybe 5 or 6 weeks, vineyard will go from looking like these cute little bud breaks to like, wow, I can't believe like we have full vines again. So just a big difference and rapid progression there. Cool. So now that our buds have broken and our shoots have grown, right, we're looking into the next phase, which is the development of flowers. So we can't have grapes without flowers. So it starts off with the flower that becomes fertilized, and then that becomes the grapes that we end up harvesting, fermenting, and then making into delicious wine, right? So in those vines, in the shoots, remember how we saw that there were buds all over the shoots? Well, inside those buds, before they even break in the springtime, right, we have microscopic components called grapevine shoot primordia. So these are like, we talk about like the development of like mammals, right? There's like a time in its development very, very early on when the hormones haven't decided if it's going to be male or female yet, right? And then like the hormones kick in and all of a sudden it develops the organs necessary to be a male or the organs necessary to be a female. So it's a lot like that for grapevines. This is like they call it uncommitted. So these are structures that have not yet been programmed for their final form, and it could be programmed to be tendrils or flowers. So it's either one of those gripping hands that helps climb, or it's a flower inflorescence, which will become the grape cluster itself, right? So very interesting thing. Here's a cross section of what that kind of primordia looks like. So this is a dormant bud. The primordium is right here at the very, very tip. So they're uncommitted cells, they're unprogrammed, and whether or not they are programmed to become a tendril or a flower really develops on a number of things like sunlight, temperature, carbohydrate reserves, and nutrients. So if your the vines are actually really amazing like this. So if the vines know I don't have enough nutrients to produce a healthy crop, it won't produce grapes. It'll just focus on surviving through that season and keeping itself alive, and then say it gets the nutrients it needs, whether through human intervention or whatever, if it's out in the wild, then it will say, okay, we're ready to develop grapes again, then hopefully spread our seed and reproduce, right? So it's kind of a really interesting concept for grapevines, but that's how it decides, right? So depending on how well you treat your vineyard, you might not get any flowers if you really abuse it, right? So nutrients are a big part of that, and carbohydrate reserves, as we'll talk about, are what stays over the winter time. So you got to have enough reserves for it to wake up in the spring, and then have enough so it decides, hey, we have enough to produce flowers and produce fruit this year. So it wants to make sure there's enough energy in the bank. And then sunlight and temperature are also very important as well. Okay, lovely. So say you're a grapevine, shoot primordia decide we're going to develop flowers that will become clusters of fruit this year. That's wonderful. Great. So as it forms, there's like a structure to how this typically pans out, and how it normally works is the flower clusters form on the opposite side of the leaf, and same is to be said about the tendrils, right? So this is a really good drawing here. We have the petiole, right, which is the stem of the leaf blade. As we go up this new shoot, we can see that we have a cluster here of what will be flower and fluorescence. And then right directly across from it, we have a leaf, and then we have a bud as well. This will be left over after the harvest season, right? This is the dormant bud. Then we have another inflorescence of flowers up here, directly across from the leaf. We have a lateral shoot blooming, and then we have nodes, and then across we have tendrils as well, right? So it's either going to be a flower cluster, which will be a fruit cluster eventually, or a tendril, right? Lovely. Interestingly enough, you can kind of do some math for your vineyard. You can try to estimate what your crop load is going to be depending on the health of your vineyard, but also how many buds you have. So if you have, so many buds per vine, and how many vines per acre or per cubic, for every like 6x6 square, you have this many one vine, say, and that vine has 12 fruiting positions. Well, every shoot for Vitis vinifera produces 2 clusters. So you could actually estimate how many clusters and then the tonnage of your vineyard every year, or what you're trying to shoot for, right? Based off of that math. So, it does pretty well, honestly. If you have the dimensions of your vineyard down, you could do it. It's also good to know that the flower positions are typically in the same part of the vine, so typically between the 3rd to 6th node from the very base of the shoot will be your flowering and berry positions. Also, if you end up getting into ampelography, which is identifying grapevines by the structure of like the clusters and the leaves, you'll want a representative leaf that's close to the fruiting position. Those will be the most characteristically indicative to identify the vine, right? Because the ones near the end or the very base are different. Okay. Flowering and fertilization. So Vitis vinifera are self-fertilizing plants. They're hermaphrodites because they have both male and female parts. So that makes them a perfect flower. So they don't need insects. They don't need don't need much to fertilize. They don't depend on anything other than some wind. The wind will come through, and what will happen is the pollen will fertilize itself, and then every single flower becomes one berry of a cluster. So this is kind of what the flowers look like before they open. It almost looks like hops or something else. And then once they open, they don't really have a huge flower or smell to them, but you can kind of see the anthers coming out, these little white tips. Then it will self-fertilize, and then every little miniature flower will become its own berry in the cluster. So this is kind of just an overview of what it looks like, how it fertilizes, and how it forms. Cool. Okay, moving on to summer in the vineyards. Summertime is, so we have like fruit set and flowering. This is kind of like spring, late spring, early summer. Summer, we'll just talk about fruit set in summer. It just kind of depends on where your vineyard's planted and where you are, right? But fruit set, so say all of the flowers have been fertilized, and now we have these cute little grapes that are forming, right? So the flower caps have fallen off. This is the egg that's been fertilized, right? And then it's developing and growing from there. So fruit set is officially defined at the stage where the berry diameter is between 1.6 and 3.2 millimeters, if you wanted to know that. Interestingly enough, only 20 to 30% of the flowers will develop into berries. There is such a thing as berry shatter, This is when a flower doesn't turn into a berry and falls off. So you can see in this right image how sad this looks, right? So a lot of the berries have fallen off, right? And this could be due to your climate, rain, hail, extreme weather can cause the flowers to become damaged and just fall off, right? Also, if you are experiencing extreme cold or heat swings in your area, you'll have a really hard time setting fruit too, because temperature is a big part of the success. Another problem you can have is something that's called hens and chicks, or chicks and hens, whatever rolls off the tongue best for you, right? It's what happens when you have uneven pollination. So just when we talked about, like, every individual flower is a berry in a cluster, right? So depending on when that flower became fertilized is when they start that race. So they start to begin that process of developing the fruit and swelling, cell division, all that fun stuff. So if it's happening at very different times, you'll have really uneven ripening, which is not ideal, right? Because we pick whole clusters at a time. We don't go through picking single berries, right? There's no way. That'd be crazy. So it can happen through just unideal spring conditions. You have bad weather, if you have nutritional deficiencies, viral infections, that can all affect it. It's also commonly called millerandage in French. I don't speak French, so I'm sorry if I butchered that. But that can happen as well, right? So you'll see a lot of, like, bunches that contain berries that differ greatly in size and maturity, and then small seedless berries amid normal berries as well, right? So the analogy, hens and chicks, hens would be like the larger berries, and then chicks are like the underdeveloped tiny berries in the cluster. Okay, so assuming that your berry formation happened and you're well into your way of developing those berries, let's talk about fall in the vineyard, right? So fall is generally the time for harvest. It's by far the most hectic and busy time for vineyard owners and winemakers. The fruit must be tested for ripeness and quality. So Brix is the sugar content, something that's measured. Also pH and total acidity. These are both acid levels, but kind of pertain to different parts of the winemaking and, like, health of the wine. And then there's a lot of struggles that vineyards have to face during this time. So, like, availability of pickers is a huge problem. We typically have, like, a lot of Mexican work groups that will sign up for multiple vineyards at a time, and they get booked up very quickly. So availability of pickers and workers. We could have rainstorms if we have an early winter come in. We don't want rain on the fruit. It could cause a lot of mildew and potential decomposition of the grapes, right? Also, power outages are not fun, even though tractors are mostly ran on fuel still and not on, there are some electric ones around. We still need electricity to process the fruit to keep it cool and to keep it safe after it's been picked, right? There's also fires, pretty self-explanatory. We don't want fires anywhere near the vineyards when the grapes are developing, because that's how we get smoke taint. It's also not healthy work conditions for our pickers or for our crew, and just not good for the people who've been affected by fires, so would not recommend. It's also really hard to just keep up with the lots that are ready to pick. If you have planted varieties that ripen around the same time, you could have, like, a grape avalanche, basically a fruit that needs to be processed. It's very hard to do all that work at once, keeping up with it. And then also coordinating the picking time with the winemaking and cellar crew is very difficult as well. So you might just be a grape grower and you might be selling your fruit to winemakers or local wineries to process, and you could say, hey, like, this is ready now. And they could say, well, that's great. I don't have any space for it till next week. Well, then your fruit's just sitting on the vine, and that whole season of hard work is kind of being, like, pushed aside, basically, right? So there's definitely an ideal time to pick the grapes, and a lot of coordination that's required during the time. So let's talk a little bit about the berry ripening process now that we kind of understand harvest and the fall season. So berry ripening does happen throughout a lot of the summer. A lot of it happens during summer and fall as well. There's some crossover here, right? So this is a really nice curve I took from my professor at UC Davis. And this just shows us, you know, days after flowering at the bottom here. So this is as soon as it's flowered, and at this point it's become fertilized. Then we have an actual image of the berry size and the coloration. So this is for a red grape variety or black, depending if you're a somm. Then it shows there's 3 different stages. The blue line is the increase of acid in the grape, and then the depletion. And then the red line is the accumulation of sugars in the grape. So after the berries are set, what happens is we have stage 1, which is a lot of cell division, and acids are accumulating. Acids peak at stage 2. If you've ever bitten into like an apple that wasn't ripe yet, like very, very tart, like harsh acid, those are the acids in grapes as well as malic acid. Then stage 3, the beginning of stage 3 is marked by something called veraison. And this is a very important term, so definitely be on the quiz. This is when the grapes start to change color and also to start to develop sugar. It isn't until veraison that sugar starts to develop and acids start to deplete. So it's an inverse relationship. And then stage 3, we have sugar acclimation, and then we also have something called engustment, which is when sensory compounds start to accumulate in the fruit itself. So all those beautiful flavors that end up being translated into the wine are being expressed in the skins of the fruit. So very cool. So that's that's the curve. Then I have the stages written out for you as well for your studying. So stage 1 is berry formation to lag phase. So we have cell division, acids and tannins develop in the grape skin and pulp. Then we have stage 2, which is lag phase to veraison. So lag phase to veraison. Stage 3, post-veraison ripening, right? So stage 2, they reach half of their size. Cell division stops, but they start to enlarge. Seed embryos begin to form and grow. Cells accumulate more acid and tannin. They will reach their peak content before veraison. Stage 3 is marked at veraison. Berries change color. They soften, accumulate sugars, and they also start to metabolize those acids. So very important to know. This will definitely be on the quiz. So very, very important to study. Okay, and then that brings us to winter. So say you survived harvest. You picked everything at the exact right time. All the sugars and acids were right where it was supposed to be. And you had happy fermentations and happy winery owners and vineyard owners. And now it's winter time. So winter time marks it's the end of harvest and things start to get really cold. Grapevines will start to shut down. They'll start to drop their leaves. The leaves will turn from green to yellow, brown, and red. They'll drop their leaves, and what they'll be left behind with are those canes. So you can see all these little sticks here at the top. So these are the canes that are left behind after all the leaves drop. And then here on this other side, you can see this is where it's been pruned. So it looks all clean and bare there. So dormancy. Temperatures will drop. The leaves will continue to form carbohydrates until they drop, or if there's a frost. The vines will be signaled to become more cold hardy to survive the winter. So they'll convert their sugars to starch and they'll store it into the roots and trunks of the vines. These are the reserves that we were talking about that need to be present for those flowers to be produced the following spring, right? So as the vine accumulates for the cold weather, no more carbohydrate accumulation occurs. So whatever they have in their reserves, just like a bank account. And they keep it through the winter, and then hopefully it's enough to get them started in the spring, right? So there's 3 stages of grapevine dormancy. There's acclimation, midwinter dormancy, and then deacclimation. So we're not going to go through those specifically, but acclimation is just as it sounds. It's starting to get cold. It's after harvest. They're turning their starch, their glucose into starch. They're storing it into the trunks, right? And then midwinter dormancy is like it's the coldest of winter. They are dormant. They're not doing anything. They're just getting through the coldest part. And then deacclimation is when it's nearing the end of winter. Things are starting to warm up again. The sun is coming out and the vine is starting to wake up again. So deacclimation. So those are just a quick overview of what's happening during dormancy. Cool. A really important thing that happens during dormancy is pruning. So you typically wait to prune until the end of winter, early spring. The shoots will lignify and become canes during dormancy, so they will become less bendy and more woody and firm. The leaves will drop off. The pruning style depends a lot on the variety, labor, and size of your production, right, and much more. We'll talk more about that in other viticulture classes. But this is a really important time because you decide how many buds to leave for the following season. So more buds equals more shoots equals more grapes. Sounds perfect, right? So why don't we just leave all of the buds? Well, that's not ideal because there's only so much the grapevine can do. There's only so many carbohydrates it can produce. And so you have to budget, right, for what the vine is going to use for itself, what it's going to use for the grapes, and what's going to use for its roots too, right, and for survival. And it has to have reserves for the following season too, right? You don't want to stretch it so thin that it's unhealthy, right? You want your vines to be healthy. So if you have too many buds, you'll have too much vegetative growth, and you'll also have an excessive amount of fruit as well, right? The vine will have a hard time ripening all that fruit. It won't have hardly enough sugar in it to make quality wine. And the vines will also be really stressed out because you've overextended them, right? On the other side of that, if you have too little buds left behind from pruning, you will have little to no fruit. You've hacked your vines, right? And then you'll lose money that year as a farmer, right? Because this is product, this is what people do for a living. So you will lose money, and that's also not ideal either. So that's one of the beautiful balances that viticulturists have to learn is vine balance. It's the vegetative growth with the fruit growth. And we talk about that more in Vidi 303. Yep. And 301. Okay, and then after those buds continue through spring, they go through bud break, and we do it all again. So that is the cycle of the grapevine in a vineyard. I hope that was helpful. These are learning objectives. So if you are nervous about studying for the quiz and making sure you have every little detail written down, I like to post my learning objectives. I will write the quiz based off of these learning objectives. So these are just something I want to make sure that you learn so that you're prepared, but also I want to be completely transparent about what I'll be testing you about. So not a lot of tricks over here, just hopefully good learning methods. But anyways, I hope that was helpful. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to email me. All right, thanks.